Hello there, today we're going to talk about why we should stop taking snapshots and start doing photography. I'm also going to give you a few tips and tricks across several photography genres to ensure you're getting the very best out of your photographs. Before we get going, this video is sponsored by the HP Pavilion 15 laptop. I've been using the laptop over the last few weeks and it's the perfect all-in-one device for creative people like yourselves to create photos, artwork and video projects. With high-end graphics powered by the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti graphics card, you no longer need to settle for average performance. Get all the power you need with the HP Pavilion 15. The current state of photography is a very interesting situation, and for some reason, quite a lot of people are very negative about it. I actually don't think there's ever been a better time for photography, with so many of us being creative and making these amazing images. And access to information and reasonably priced gear has never been better and cheaper. It often seems like a lot of that negative energy comes from the fact that getting attention on your work or getting discovered is potentially getting more and more difficult as time goes on. This is a particular problem for professionals or aspiring professionals and can so often lead to jealousy and that all too often occurrence of the photography being bashed, particularly online on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and things like that. The current state of discovery and attention though is not the same thing as the current state of photography. Happily though, this video is not about attention and discovery. But one thing I always say when I give talks is that we should enjoy other photographers' work, celebrate their success, tell them why you like their work, raise people up around you rather than cutting them down. And you'll be amazed what that does for your attention and discovery. Now, one of the problems that we're faced with is that we always hear phrases like, everybody's a photographer these days because everyone's got a mobile phone. Now, yes, everyone is taking pictures, but does that make them photographers? Almost everyone writes, but does that make us all writers? We've all drawn pictures at some point in our time, but hardly any of us become great illustrators. I can tinkle the ivories on a piano, but it doesn't mean I'm going to become a concert pianist. The fact is that photography is still a relatively new medium. It's only in the last 20 years or so since the digital revolution that everybody has got a camera in their hand. So we're still trying to understand what the artistic nature of photography is. One of the issues with photography as well is that it lends itself to the media, things like the paparazzi going around. And it is really difficult to argue that that is art. The photography media itself hasn't helped over the years either because so much of it is focused on the gear and the technical aspects of photography. And that's understandable really because the human desire for stuff, new stuff, drives those clicks and drives that ad revenue that those media companies need to make. I'm keen to reframe the conversation away from that stuff onto the more artistic side of photography. We know there are millions of billions even of snapshots uploaded to the internet every day. And I think we need to sort of redefine what that is because I don't think it's photography. I don't think it's art. Now, I don't want to seem pretentious and I'm not excluding anybody, but it's simply about the intention of the person taking that image. Basically, it's snapshots versus photographs. 99.99999% of the images that get uploaded every day are snapshots. They're selfies, they're little family snaps, holiday snaps, tourist snaps. You've seen them, I'm sure you have, and they're the kind of images that really no one is ever going to want to look at again, including the person sometimes that took the image. Now clearly there's nothing wrong with that because that person is just documenting that moment in time, and I take pictures like that as well sometimes. The point it becomes art though, I think, is the point at which the person taking that image tries to take a better image. They think more meaningfully about what they're doing to take a better picture and to tell and communicate a story. So what can we do and what can we encourage others to do to stop taking snapshots and start doing photography, to really help everybody else to understand what the beautiful art of photography is all about? The first thing to do is start thinking about your composition and perspective. Just very simple things, like when you're taking a picture of a child, your child, just take a knee, get down low to their level and take the picture that way rather than just looking down at them, it instantly creates a more interesting picture. Thinking about rules of composition is also very helpful. So I think we'll get into the computer and look at a few examples. So probably the most obvious and the best known rule of composition is the rule of thirds. That's where we have these intersecting lines that make a 3x3 grid. And the theory is that you place points of interest in your photograph along those lines, whether they're the vertical ones or the horizontal ones. And then specifically as well at the point where those lines intersect. That's a really great place to put your point of interest. I don't know why it works, but it's a rule of composition that's existed from long before photography. It's just something that appeals to us as humans. So let's have a look at a few examples. We start off here with a landscape photograph. This is the one I took in Norway not so long ago, and I put the rule of thirds over the top just so you can see. And with landscape photography, what works a lot of the time is having that rule of thirds line on the horizon. It works whether you put it on the top one or on the bottom one, but if you have a landscape photograph with the horizon right through the middle of the frame along this line here, that's what can often lead to a snapshot type looking image. So just raise up, raise down a little bit, and you are good to go. Here's another example where the horizon is a bit harder to define. So what I've done is placed the edge of the lake across the bottom of the rule of thirds. I've put the top of the mountain towards the top of the rule of thirds, and that just works really nicely for that image. I've got this sort of gap in the mountains here as well, in that little valley there on the rule of thirds as well. That's why that image works quite nicely. Also works for landscapes if you do it vertically as well. So I've got, again, the horizon line along that top rule of thirds. I've then got this rock on that intersection, these rocks on that little intersection. Just very simple, very easy to follow, works really well for landscape photography. Next up, it also works for portrait photography. This is a wedding photograph I took. And here you can see that the chap's head here is right on that intersecting line, pretty much. Or the intersection here. We've got the girl's eyes are nicely along that rule of third line at the top. We then, if you come down this line here, you can see that the glass is kind of right on the rule of thirds as well. And then in the background here, you've kind of got the post here on that rule of thirds, and then same with that post there along that rule of thirds, and her arm as well. So it fits really nicely within that rule of thirds. It doesn't mean you always need to get it right at the time of shooting as well. Do your best, but then if you then need to crop it down to something more appealing in post-production later, you can most definitely do that. Now, there are many rules of composition, but another interesting one to talk about, I think, is one called the golden spiral. And it's based on some numbers, the Fibonacci sequence, where the two previous numbers add up to the next number in the sequence. Complicated, but it works for composition and has existed in nature and in art for a long, long time, like the spiral of many flowers and sunflowers and things like that. But it works well when we're composing photographs as well. So here is a great example of where I have used it for this lady getting ready for a wedding, and she's got the makeup artist putting makeup on. But I've composed it so that generally you put this sort of point of interest where you start on the spiral there. So that in this case, that's the lady's eye. And then your sort of vision naturally follows this line, the spiral, round that image. So we're going round this sort of spiral here, which flows into the makeup artist's hand and then round to the makeup artist's head. It sometimes just works really nicely to add a little bit of interest above and beyond what the rule of thirds can do. I talk much more about it in terms of landscape photography and how we can use it for that in the masterclass in the Raw Room. So you might want to check that out. But let's have a look at another image where I've used the golden spiral. This is for a selfie, pretty much. This was for a thumbnail for a video quite a while ago. I've just very simply placed myself in that golden spiral region where we start. You then follow the line around here. It kind of follows the spiral round along the landscape here, it matches the kind of direction of that path here as well, and then up towards that beautiful sunset. And it's just something slightly different because I'm a bit wider out than the rule of thirds there, and it just works quite nicely. The horizon isn't quite in the rule of thirds on this one either, but it still works because I've applied the golden spiral to this composition. So the next thing is to think about your background, because composition's fine, but if you've got a messy background, then things are not going to work. That happens in woodland photography quite a lot, or some wildlife photography where we're not quite thinking about what's behind the subject. In this instance, I've thought about my background and used the natural contrast that exists in this image to isolate the subject, which in this case is the tree. So a shaft of light came through a gap in the mountain, lit up that tree, but didn't light up the background. So I have a natural contrast there that's bringing that tree out of that background and making that image work really nicely. We can also do that by controlling the light. So this is my water drop photography. I'll be releasing the masterclass on how to do this very soon into the raw room, probably this week coming up. By controlling the light and controlling your background, having a plain background, either black, white, grey, coloured if you want to, you can isolate that subject and put all the emphasis onto that subject. And it just creates a really sort of direct story about what your subject is and works really nicely like that. You can also do it with bokeh. So that's what I've done here with this shot from a wedding. Again, the same girl from before. But using that bokeh, I've got all of the attention on the girl's eyes there. She's getting her hair done and I've blown the background out. Even though that hairdresser is very close to her, at 2.8 aperture, which I've shot this, it just about puts the hairdresser into the bokeh enough in the background to focus that attention on the girl. You can see the hairspray there in the picture as well. I've also used the window light behind her to sort of brighten that background up, which again puts emphasis right back down onto the bride here. So that's another way, by blowing portraits out in the background, that you can make things work. Within the raw room, recently I've launched a monthly challenge, and actually this month's challenge was bokeh. And some of the people that are subscribed came up with some stunning images. And I think I've got a couple that I wanted to show you because they're a fine example of where people are doing photography rather than snapshots. And here is one of the first images. This is a macro shot of a water drop on a leaf with this cheeky little woody doll sneaking into the image. And it's a beautiful image with this intersecting triangle coming into that overall bright red image that just grabs your attention straight away. Fantastic image. And when we look at the next picture, we look at the setup that Paul used to shoot this. It's just fantastic. Look at the setup here. Would you think that could create an image like that? It's just creative, it's artistic. And that's what I love about photography. And it's just such a good example of where this goes so much beyond just a snapshot, because it's that amount of work that it's taken to do that. Here's another example from the landscape scene. Another image that just people taking a snapshot would never take this kind of photograph. Positioning that beautiful flower with Trifan there as well in the background, that mountain, and they've created such a beautiful image that's so different to what you normally see as well, just with that little bit of creativity, using that background blur, and just go so far beyond what you would normally consider to be a snapshot. Another place with portrait photography where you can take them beyond a snapshot is just to be aware of where you are cutting limbs off with the edge of your frame. It's always good to be conscious of the edge of your frame, whether you're doing landscapes and you don't want little rocks and trees and things creeping in without it being intended. But likewise with portraits, you don't want to cut limbs off when you haven't intended it. So things like fingertips getting cut off, or if you're taking a full body shot, cutting toes off feels very unnatural. Cutting feet off, it just doesn't feel right. So be conscious of the edge of your frame. If you do need to cut off parts of people's bodies, cut them off in the middle of their limbs rather than at the joints. Don't cut people off at the elbows or the shoulders or the waist or the knees, because it just feels unnatural for some reason. If you cut them off in the middle of limbs, like the middle of the arm or the middle of the thighs or if you're doing a 3/4 shot like I am here, kind of cut it off in the middle of the body rather than sort of really high up or at the waist, because it just doesn't feel right. So make sure you cut people off at the right point intentionally. Always be aware of what's going on around the edges of your frame. And that's another key part of your composition, which is going to raise your images beyond just being snapshots. And it's something you can tell other people to do as well. Post-processing is also an important step in taking your images beyond just being snapshots. It's an important part of the photographic process, but it does mean you will need a computer. Happily though, this video is sponsored by the HP Pavilion 15 laptop. It's the perfect all-in-one device to edit your photos, and it's powered by that NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti graphics card. With the latest processor and over 11 hours of battery life, I've been using it happily to edit my videos on my travels over the last few weeks. I put a link down below for you to check that out, but it's got all the power you're going to need to really take your images to the next level. So once we've gone above and beyond and made photographs rather than just snapshots, like we talked about last week, go ahead and create a print. Make that beautiful final piece of art.